So let's take a look at what we're going to call a pre-ferment. A couple different kinds. We have one right here called a poolish. So Ben made this yesterday. He put together flour, water, and a little bit of yeast. And I think it was about this high when he started. Overnight, that built up, and you can see the carbon dioxide in there. If we gave this the sniff test, what other kind of aromas should we have here? We can physically see the carbon dioxide. What kind of aroma? Well, okay, we have the three byproducts of yeast fermentation. So we'd say it smells like yeast, but we can break that down a little bit further. So, what? Alcohol. So it should smell kind of alcoholic. And one other thing. What was the third byproduct of yeast fermentation? What's that? Acidity. Okay, so could you give that a sniff? How's your nose working this morning? Give that a little sniff test for us. Any good aromas coming out of there? So this is on most any kind of bread. You can take some of the flour, some of the water, and some of the yeast, put that together, and let that rise for as long a period as you would like until it's usually considered ripe when it comes up and just starts to go back down. If we let this go till tomorrow, it would actually go down a little bit. And it gets pretty strong as far as the flavor is concerned. So this is called a poolish. Real easy to mix because it's equal amounts flour and water. So as you can see, it's real soupy. And just a teeny bit of yeast and poof. Now, why isn't there any salt in there? The salt retards the rising, right. So we just want this to go to town, and then this is going to help to flavor our bread. For your bread to get a lot of flavor, you need a lot of fermentation time. This is one way to kind of skirt around that, and this could go into a pizza dough, it can go into baguette dough, it could go into white bread dough, a lot of different doughs it could go in. Biggest thing is for flavor. You could buy this in a powdered form, fake flavor, but this is the real way that you would have to do it, okay? And when we make some bread, some of us are going to make some beer bread today. And once we put the beer in for the liquid in the bread, it doesn't rise quite as well. So this is like a jump start for the flavor in the beer bread, okay? So those of you who make beer bread, I'm going to set it over here. And you'll use that later. So, poolish, equal parts flour and water. See, 100% water, like we talked about yesterday. Equal part water to flour. Then a teeny bit of yeast. Some chefs use what's called a sponge, and that simply has less water in it. So it's more like the dough ball, the pain ordinaire that we made yesterday, 65% hydration like we made yesterday. Just another style. And then we have the wild yeast one. We started that yesterday, right? So let's go and check on that progress, see how that's doing. Oh, here we go. So as you recall, we went in the refrigerator and got that starter, and then we added flour, took a little bit of that, added flour and water to it, and now we have this kind of bubbling mass there. You want to give this little sniff check for us? We'll use your nose as the standard here. So we got some fermentation flavor in there going, some yeast flavor in there. Now well, there's one big difference now between this and that. And what is that? The wild yeast versus commercial yeast, okay? So whenever you see levain, pan au levain, bread made with a levain, that would be a wild yeast culture. The other one's made with commercial yeast, okay? And what comes in here besides the yeast, what was in here that helps the flavor? Another biological organism, bacteria. So we have yeast fermentation, bacterial fermentation, more flavor, deeper flavor. So let's see, how are we going to put that together? Well, here's a little, let's take a look at this slide here. So what do we need first of all? Well, we need some wild yeast and get that in a culture. So that was, we took the fresh flour months and months ago, added water to that, let it sit around for a while, built it up for about 8 or 10 days. It took a while to get that thing going. And so then we put that in the refrigerator. And yesterday, then we took out part of that and built it into its child, called the levain, all right? Starter in the refrigerator, so we could make another child tomorrow, as far as it's concerned. Now, what's happening in here all night long? So you told me we have yeast fermentation, right? So we have yeast fungus fermentation producing acetic acid. Do you remember what kind of acidity was produced by the bacteria? Similar to yogurt and dairy products. That would be a lactic acidity. Lactic acid, tart. Acetic acid, more sweet. So you have two kinds, like using two kinds of vinegar in a vinaigrette. And then what kind of bread are we going to make? Oh. So pain au levain, bread made with a wild yeast culture, is then the translation. Okay? Okay, so now we're going to make our pain au levain bread. And we said that our flour is represented by 100%. And so we're to figure out how much bread we're going to make, well, we're just going to pick an amount of flour that we're going to use. And the reason I picked 10 pounds of flour is because this is 1 pound, and we want it to be 10% of our flour weight. If you wanted your bread to be more sour, this could be 15% or 20%, and then the bread would be more tart. Usually the Americans like their the sourdough bread we think of as very tart, but in Europe the wild yeast bread is more sweet. So ours is going to be a little bit on the sweeter side here, so I went with 10%. So if I use then 10 pounds of flour, I need 1 pound of levain. So let's get on there. Then, oh, one other thing. In my 10 pounds of flour, we talked about the fresh ground wheat yesterday. So as we're going to use our 10 pounds of flour, we're going to use 8 pounds of bread flour and 2 pounds of fresh ground grain. So Ben did this yesterday, and Ben, we have rye and spelt, is that correct? So we got some rye flour in here, some spelt flour in here, and then 8 pounds of our regular bread flour, okay? But the total is 10. So let's see, what else we got? So levain then represents 10% of all this, so we got 1 pound of that. And then the salt. As I recall, we needed 2% salt, right, in most everything, in most all yeasted breads. Well, to figure that, maybe we can, who was Math Man over here? Was that you yesterday, Math Man? So Math Man, if we had 10 pounds of flour, how many ounces would that be? 10 times 16? 160. So for every 100, for 100 ounces of flour, how much salt would we need? At 2%, 2 ounces, that's pretty simple. Well, we got another 50 in there, so for every 50 ounces of flour, how much salt do we need? 1 ounce. So that's 150 ounces worth. Now we got 10 more ounces of flour. And, well, see, you know, I've got some flour in here, and I'm going to use kosher salt. So we can go with 3.5 ounces, should be right there in the ballpark, okay? So we're just making up a recipe. This is how a baker would make up a recipe, all right? And then, do I need any yeast? Ah, there you go. The yeast is in here. So this one is just basically, if you looked at the ingredients on the package, it would say flour, water, and salt. That's all we have. Now there's some yeast in here there's yeast in all flour, but we just let this one mature, that's all. So if some people, this would be called yeast-free bread. Well, technically, we've got yeast in there, you know, but well, we've got to have the water. So water we're going to run at 70%. Remember our pan ordinaire yesterday was 68%. Usually this whole grain flour needs a little bit more water. And since I'm going to mix it by hand, I'd like it to be a little bit softer so I don't have to work quite so hard. So let's see, 7 pounds of water, that should be pretty much 7 pints, right? So there I am, right in the ballpark, 7 pints, 7 pounds of water. Okay, I think we're ready to put this together. And I've got the salt right here on the side, so I'm going to mix that in there a little bit. $30-cent scraper instead of a $5,000 mixer. Let's see, we should be able to tap in on some information from yesterday. What's my first step here? Incorporate to, let's use that big fancy word, hydrate. Let's get everything wet. Once we get everything wet, then we'll have some gluten. And didn't we extrude a little bit? So we'll get 2 hands in there this time. A little extruding. So how much bread are we going to have total? How much dough are we going to have? Total weight.
18 pounds.
There you go, 18 pounds. So 10 plus 7 plus 1. So we got 18 pounds of bread. We do that, then let's review this pan ornaire. Now, you weren't here yesterday, and you weren't here yesterday, and you weren't here yesterday. So turn to the last page in your packet. The last page of everything. And what can now this will be nice and tasty in my pan ordinaire, so I'm just going to leave that go, okay? So we have our little 25 ounces of flour. I got the salt, I got the yeast in there, I got my 17 ounces of water. And as I recall, I should mix all the dry ingredients together, right? To get the yeast all distributed. This is instant yeast, so it goes in with the dry ingredients. Got the salt in there. In goes the water. Let's hydrate that. Anybody make pizza with their dough last night? Where'd all the dough goes? In the fridge? Oh. Okay, so here we go. Remember, extrude that a little bit. Let's put it on the table. So you can get through, extrude that. Now today we're going to use our Big Bertha mixer over there, the special bread mixer. And if you watch the mixer go around, the dough is going to look just like that. Like a little chain. Now that's not exactly what the Hobart mixer does, right? So these Hobart mixers, they're much more all-purpose. They don't really mix bread very well. Of course, the idea with a mixer would be that it would imitate mixing by hand. So if we watch that big mixer go around, it's going to look a lot more like your hand mixing. That would be the idea. Okay, so you wanted me then to let that rest just a little bit, right? So we're hydrating. What is hydrating in that flour? 2 things. The what?
The water
It's hydrating.
is absorbing.
Yeah, but what 2 things in the flour are being hydrated? We had 2 main food groups in there, right? Starch and the protein. The starch and the protein. So the water is going into the starch and the protein. It just takes a little time. You can't really force it. Back to our big batch over here. Up on the table. What's a bowl like this cost? Anybody know? About $250. But that's a lot better than a $5,000 Hobart mixer, which wouldn't mix this much bread anyhow. So with a 30-cent tool and a halfway decent-sized bowl, a person could make a lot of bread. So now what do? I got this thing all hydrated. What's next? What? And that's, what are we going to call when we fold? Okay, now we're going to knead it, K-N-E-A-D. So it ended up being, like you said, a kind of a folding thing. So a stretch and a fold. A fold. Remember, we put it on the table, fold it over. So just a larger version of our little bread right here. And I was going to do that for how long? Till it starts to break a little bit. So I think I'm just about there. Nice. Now these, what we're going to call artisan doughs, or the doughs that go back to before mixers, were usually a lot more slack. So you look at this dough, and this is a lot softer than most of the pizza doughs you would have. But it's going back to a time when it was mixed by hand. And the stiffer the dough, the harder it is to mix by hand. So this was the classic way, let's say. And right over here, we're going to put that in a bus tub. And we're going to let that, well, let's see, maybe I'll let you tell me. What's my next step with this? Let it rest for about 5 to 15 minutes. I'm going to let it go for about half an hour. And then after half an hour, I'm going to reach in there. I'm going to give it a pull. It's going to stretch out farther than that and flop it over. Give this side a pull, flop it over. So we'll do that 3 more times. So Ben's going to cover this up, and we'll write our time on there. So Ben, we're at 7:30. So at 8 o'clock, 8:30, and 9:30, we'll stretch it and flop it over. So that it didn't take too much high-tech stuff to get that made. And I'm going to take a little of this goo off my hands. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, a good way to get the dough off your hands, just put your hands in some flour, rub it up dub. Hopefully you don't have a half a loaf of bread on your hands. Now that wild yeast, one of the differences in the commercial yeast, besides flavor is the big thing, it is also not as aggressive. So instead of taking an hour and a half for our fermentation, it's going to take about 4 hours. So I will not shape those loaves until about 12 o'clock this afternoon. And then once I get into a loaf shape, it would take another 4 hours to get big enough to go in the oven. So at 12 o'clock, I'll shape the loaves. If I don't want to be here till 4 o'clock, you got any suggestions for me? Proofing box, that really won't help us. The refrigerator. So let's have it take a longer time. We'll put it in the refrigerator, slow down the rising. Instead of taking 4 hours, it'll take 12 hours, but that'll be just right. Okay? Back to our pan ordinaire here. I think we're ready for our first kneading. We're going to get a workout, so again, let it stretch out a little bit. Fold over, so you're going to do a stretch and a fold over. For how long? Just until the rubber bands start to break, okay? I think I can go one more time. That's it right there. Now what do I do with it? Let it sit. Cover it. Thank you. For how long? So we'll probably end up with about 15 minutes today. Now on your bread making schedule, we can stretch all those times to the maximum today. After I give it its second kneading, then I'm going to let it rise for an hour and a half. Then we'll do a punch and fold. The more patience you have, the better the bread will be. Yesterday we were just under a little time constraint, so today hit on the upward side of all those numbers. All right? Questions on that so far? Pan and levain, what would that mean? What? Wild yeast, no commercial yeast, okay? Then as all of you guys mix your dough today, again, we have the water in the sink, so start with that water. What's probably the temperature of that water? It should be about 80 degrees, okay? If you'd be so kind, could you stick your thermometer in here and see what temperature we've got for our bread, the finest dough? What's the best temperature for good yeast fermentation on our bread? In the mid-70s, okay? So let's see what we got on that one. Okay, so we take our pan au levain here, And this dough is so soft, if I put my hands back in there, I'm just going to get all stuck all over it again. So this time I'm going to use some water. So put a little water in my hands. Show an 80? We like it. Give it a stretch. Over you go. Give it a stretch. Over you go. Okay? And we'll do that again in 30 minutes. I'll give it a 90-degree turn. So one thing about this bread, for the true pain au levain, it takes a lot of patience, that's all. And patience usually takes some forethought, but that's why we're chefs. That's why we go to chef school. We hopefully learn to think ahead a little bit. So we'll cover that. Then back on our pain ordinaire here, let's see if he's ready for some more exercise. Before exercise, again, we stretch out a little bit. So there we go. So let him stretch out. So this will be our second kneading, right? So we're making those rubber bands, rubber bands stronger. Okay? Now what do I do with that? Let it rise. I'm going to go an hour and a half, and then we'll do a punch and fold. So at that, it's 8 o'clock, so 9:15 or so, then I'll do... now this is risen, mine's risen for about an hour and a half, and now it's ready for a punch and fold. So let's see, I get my scraper. Now don't tear it out of the bowl. Everything's nice and easy now, nice and easy and gentle. Try not to get too much flour out there. Now that was the punch part. Now some people pugilize and get a hammer and call the horses in and ride it. It's not necessary, okay? You're just trying to knock some of those gases out of there. And then we're going to give it a tug. 1 corner, 2 corners, 3 corners, 4 corners. That's the punch and fold. And that's just another round of exercise. And just another round of exercise. But you see, each time got a little bit less. It's just like the technique for kneading, just like the second knead. But the first knead was like, what, 12 times, slap, slap, slap. Second kneading, just about 6, not so slappy. This time a lot more gentle and just less folds. 30 minutes, and then we'll divide and pre-shape. Like okay, so now we're at the point of dividing. So there you go. And pre-shaping. Now this is maybe the part that Grandma didn't have to do because she just made a loaf or 2 of bread. But if you're dealing with bigger globs of dough, then the baker has to decide, well, do I want a 1-pound piece, a 2-pound piece, a 3-pound piece like those guys have down there? We want to, for our pain ordinaire, our baguette, we want a 1-pounder. And for our baguette, of course, we want that long, skinny loaf of bread. So we want to pre-shape it into a longer cylinder. So over you go. So take a square. Over you go. That gives you a little extra muscle. Everything's getting organized. And with this one, I'll make my little ficelle. Over you go. It's got to rest for how long? About 30 minutes again. Let the glutens rest. Then we'll do our final shaping. Okay? So final one, here's our final shaping. Here's our pre-shaped pain ordinaire baguette. We're going to put the top down, dab it in a little bit of flour, a little bit of degassing, not too much. We're going to make a mussel. Mussel number 2 goes just a little bit over mussel number 1. Now we got mussel number 1, mussel number 2. Now we're going to put them together for one mussel. We want the length of the baguette pan. Might need a little dab of flour there. Start in the middle, a little outward pressure. Get the loaf to roll all the way over, not just halfway, all the way over. There's a little seam that runs along the bottom. That would be the bottom of the loaf, just like that. So we got our finished loaves of bread here, and as you see as your scores, they should go right down the top of the loaf, and it ends up on the middle part of the loaf. If you try to score way down here on the side, so you can't see the scores from the side, right? Because they're on the top of the loaf. So if you take your loaf today and you see the scores on the side, you just got too much angle. So you see this little 1/4 inch sliver right here? That's what we're looking for, all right? And what was this called again, this little piece right here?
Ear.
The ear. So some people like a big ear, some people like a little ear. The more you put your razor blade down like this, the bigger that ear is going to be, okay? And then what was this called again, this little guy? Ficelle, okay? Now everybody's made 2 baguettes. You get one and I get one. Over there under the roll sheeter in the corner are some baguette bags, special baguette bags. Take a bag, take the one home that you want, take the fanciest one, it's cool. But you might want to eat it here, right over there at the table. Amanda's set up a little breakfast buffet for us. Is it out there yet? Yeah, there we go. So you can take your baguette. These are made to be eaten within about 2 hours of when they're baked. There's no fat in here, there's no sugar in here. They have a very short shelf life. They get stale real fast. And so usually in France they'll have 2 bakings, one for lunch, one for dinner. Okay? So you're eating them now really at kind of a prime. It's pretty hard to get a baguette this fresh that you're going to eat unless you're going to school and making them every day. So I think you'll be in for a nice treat on that.